Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Association of the United States Army's annual conference and trade show in Washington, D.C., #1 gathering of U.S. Army leaders from around the world. Our coverage here is sponsored by General Motors Defense, Bell, L3 Harris, and Leonardo DRS, and it's our honor to be talking to two great Americans, one from Capitol Hill, the ranking member of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee in the House of Representatives, Mike Turner of the great city of Dayton, Ohio, proud Republican. It's an absolute pleasure. And the 24th Secretary of the United States Army, Ryan McCarthy. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us. Sir, I want to start with you. It's now prime budget season. There's a talk to us about how you see this budget outlook. You know, there are some concerns about whether or not the continuing resolution we're under may go to a full year continuing resolution. Talk to us about where we are, where you hope to be, and sir, I want to get your take on this as well, because no Bucks, no Buck Rogers, and a lot of it starts and ends with you guys.
Well, the FY20 to 21 deal's on the table. We've been working very hard with the committees of jurisdiction in particular to work through any final issues associated with that. About 6 weeks to go with the continuing resolution. We've had members come and visit us on the floor, obviously, and we've had a lot of good discussions. I'll be up on the Hill tomorrow, all afternoon, but I'm confident that we can come together and get closure by the end of the calendar year.
Sir, what do you think? I mean, there are a little bit of political challenges, a little bit of unrest on the other side of the aisle with the emergency declaration. Obviously, there's nothing the department can do when the president does that. Talk to us about how you think this process is going to play out, and is there a genuine fear that there could be a full year CR?
Well, I think what's really important throughout this entire process, and I want to thank the Secretary of the Army for this, is that confidence in the budgetary process, in the ability for DoD to acquire innovation, to pull that forward, and the types of reforms that we need in acquisition. The Secretary of the Army has been phenomenal in looking for ways to innovate, to get it faster to our men and women in uniform, and that's, I think, what's so exciting also about being here today in the backdrop of to see what really could be the future of the Army, what could be next for our men and women in uniform. I think the mood on Capitol Hill is to get the work done. We've got, I think, a very good National Defense Authorization Act, very good groundwork for the appropriations bills. It's just getting it done. There's a lot of noise going on Capitol Hill that has nothing to do with defense. We need to push that aside and move forward. The Secretary of Defense was just on Capitol Hill yesterday, and he was making the case as to what the damage occurs to the Department of Defense under continuing resolutions. It's not just delay. There's waste, there's an inability to move forward, there's lack of training, there's investment that cannot be caught up, and it goes right to the readiness of our troops.
I'm going to be very cognizant because you're not going to be able to stay for the full interview, but I do want to ask you a little bit about NATO and about Syria and about Turkey, because you're a key member of the parliamentary panel, the Transatlantic NATO Parliamentarians panel. Let me ask you, sir, about lessons you learned. Right, the night court process, everybody in the Army leadership, we're hearing it from Secretary Esper, that even with flat budgets, which is the expectation at this point, or marginally increasing budgets, some big choices are going to have to be made. The Army, you were integrally part of that team, and so was General McConville when he was the vice and you were the under, where you guys tried to work some of these big trade-offs, these big muscle movements. You wanted to cancel, for example, the Chinook Block 2. Members of Congress had a different idea, and Congress had a different idea, and so now that project's going forward. What were some of the lessons you learned? Because some big trade-offs are going to have to be needed. What are the lessons you learned about how to sell that? And sir, what I want to get your take on is how members have to change how they think about some of this stuff, because the national security depends on sometimes making trade-offs, even if it may hurt somebody's district. Sir?
So we truncated the buys of 93 programs and terminated 93 others, and right now we're 185 for 186. So it's pretty good free throw percentage. With respect to the Chinooks, the long lead parts the funding for that was put back in by the committees of jurisdiction, and one of the things was is the Congress as a whole, but committees in particular, did they truly understand the strategy for the aviation portfolio? We thought we were exhaustive in the process, but many questions remain. So I think we took a step back, take a look at where we are in the process. Going forward, they're going to have to appreciate that the pressure on the aviation portfolio by introducing 2 new platforms and keeping the legacy systems, something will have to give. Because as you mentioned in your comments about a flat budget over the long term, you have to be ruthless in your prioritization. With respect to the Chinook, it's the healthiest asset in the fleet, it's the youngest, and we have a 10% ORF. So the risk is much dramatically reduced, coupled with the fact that the United Kingdom, the United Arab Emirates, and potentially the Afghan National Security Forces are lining up to procure these helicopters. A robust pipeline of foreign military sales. I personally met with leadership in the UAE in the United Kingdom to advocate on behalf of the American manufacturer. So we're very confident about the strength of that supply chain to support the G models, which we buy for our special operations version. But we cannot afford to do this for conventional platforms going forward.
Let me ask you, sir, I mean, what's the right way for the department to go around this, and what are the best ways to address equities that lawmakers have on the part of their constituents, and how do you balance that against the fact that, hey, look, even though we've done this and had this platform for 5 decades, it may be time to just move on?
Well, I think the Secretary's doing a great job and articulate, his vision of how to go forward. Ryan it has great in-depth knowledge, and that's certainly important for the debate. In my time in Congress, it really hasn't been parochial issues that have resulted in Congress not buying into a program being terminated. Generally, it's been real concerns about operational needs of the warfighter and how we operate. For example, the A-10, obviously we had the Air Force was trying to stop the A-10 today. The A-10, no one would consider coming forward and proposing to Congress that it be killed. It's important that we have the overall debate. Same thing for the Abrams tank plant. The Obama administration tried several times to close the plant. Today, it would be unimaginable for us for that plant to have been closed. So it's just balancing the debate as we go forward to make certain that we make the right decisions, and I think that's a very good and healthy debate.
I want to just say for the record, I'm not one of the people who doesn't think that Congress doesn't occasionally get it right. Unmanned aircraft was a similar sort of thing where there was enormous investment on the part of John Warner in that capability that ended up becoming something useful for the future. I think your time is very short, so let me ask you a question about the president's policy and withdrawal from Syria. Russian forces have taken over a lot of those installations that we abandoned in very, very short order. And we also have an extraordinary position where a NATO ally, NATO is all about shooting at somebody else who's shooting at the alliance. I don't think there's precedent for one NATO ally to actually be shooting at another NATO ally, at least in recent memory. Talk to us about both of that and what lawmakers' concerns are, given that there is a concern even from the senior-most leaders in private, but also the retired community and lawmakers about how this could have been a strategic mistake, the withdrawal of U.S. troops from northern Syria.
Well, I just returned this weekend from a NATO Parliamentary Assembly meeting. Secretary General Stoltenberg was there and spoke of the work that he's doing in trying to coordinate with NATO and with Turkey. Certainly there's been a lot of voices that have in Congress that have indicated their concern. It certainly is troubling to see what is occurring. We have to be very concerned that we do not backslide with respect to controlling ISIS. But this is somewhat ungoverned territory. We're not in Syria, had not been in Syria as a result of Syria requesting us to be there. Russia's there, Iran's there, ISIS is there, and Turkey has had a significant amount of destabilization along their border. I think there's a significant amount of international pressure that's being placed on Turkey to ensure that their actions are to secure the border of Turkey and Syria and not just attack Kurds, who have been a very helpful ally to the United States.
But isn't there, right, it was very calm. Those Kurdish forces were integral to us rounding up. We had 12,000 people in prisons up there. At the end of the day, there didn't seem to be, there were a lot of refugees that were on the Turkish side of the border, but those forces seemed to be quite loyal and quite focused on doing what it is we wanted them to do, by extension as forces for us to force magnify us. Do you see sort of a strategic challenge now that Russia has moved into that corridor and right into some installations that we were in fact manning until 48 hours ago?
It's a very difficult landscape, obviously, but we were not in Syria to counter Russia. Obviously it was one of the benefits because Russia is a declared adversary. They are trying to prop up the Assad regime, which was being murderous to its own people, and so our adversity to Russia is certainly something that's well stated. But Secretary of Defense was just on Capitol Hill, and he made this statement that I think is very important as to what was happening in the area and how it was deteriorating, how Turkey was going in. They were not invited in by the United States. There was no aspect of the United States indicating that our departure would allow their entrance. They made the declaration that they're going in, and the Secretary of Defense has responsibility for the safety and security of the men and women in uniform that are Americans.
And last question, do you think it's unprecedented that Turkey was firing on American positions? Is that potentially problematic, and how does the alliance raise that and address it?
Well, I think we all need more detail as to what was occurring there. Obviously, the Secretary of Defense has registered with Turkey his concerns, and both before Turkey went in, and they had informed us prior to their going in, and while it's ongoing. But
clearly, Vice President is clearly there now in Ankara.
Right. Hopefully, the president's called for a ceasefire. I know there's a number of proposals to look at sanctions that could restrain Turkey's adventuresomeness in the area versus just their securing their border. But it certainly is going to, I think, for a long time remain an area of trouble.
Mike Turner, ranking member of Strategic Forces in the House, Republican from Ohio. Sir, thanks very much. So let me ask you, and that was really great, but I want to focus a little bit on some of the Army-specific questions. So size of Army, formations, deployability, you're working on all of these things. First, give us a little bit of a preview on the 21 program objective memorandum. That's in the works right now. A lot of major muscle movements. You know, we've heard from the chief in terms of redesigning the personnel and talent management systems. Talk to us about what we're going to see in this 21 POM that is going to put you on that road to multi-domain operational capability in 2028.
So we're marching across the FIDIP right now, Vago. I think, you know, so if you look at 18 and 19.
You're looking pretty good, by the way, for where we are in the march right now.
I don't want to get too excited, but 18 and 19, we aligned 80% of the S&T and over half of the procurement dollars against the signature systems, the 31 signature systems across our investment portfolios. So a very aggressive start in priming the pump. But what all these prototypes are starting to land in the system, and this is where we start to see a lot of the funding had been roughly against prototyping and experimentation, because we are definitely going to fly before we buy. And we learned from the past, so a lot of that funding lines up there to have a very robust experimentation and prototyping phase, and that'll get you to LRIP. So the 21 program will be aligning more funding against that, so we can collapse that time to get to an LRIP for many of the systems that you see in that 31.
And you're also talking about some major trade-offs. You want to increase artificial intelligence investments, cyber investment as well. Northrop is our cyber sponsor, and we put together a weekly cyber report in partnership with them. But talk to us about how you want to direct additional funding to hypersonics, you know, and a whole bunch of what are seen to be as strategic enabling technology.
So there's probably a handful. First is the cloud architecture. AI is the exciting buzz phrase that you hear a lot of, but you can't have artificial intelligence without a cloud architecture and data that is formatted and have the right protocols so you can move information seamlessly through weapons systems, so you can reduce the span time for decisions in a firefight, but also for making business decisions. So it's as much of an administrative function as the warfighting. So we're putting roughly $800 million across the FIDIP that we have laid in to pursue the cloud for the entire Army. The other thing is, when you mentioned hypersonics and directed energy, hypersonics is something the Army specifically has taken the lead on. Much of the engineering work that's been done over the several years has been by Army engineers out of Huntsville. So we have a joint agreement with all the other services in MDA. We're sharing information. We're trying to align the test regimes, but it is not a joint program. It is joint interest. Right. And with that, we can try to look at how do we get economies of scale by scaling the buys together, but also really is sharing of information and lessons learned. So we're very excited about that. It's a very aggressive effort. It's a national priority that Secretary Mattis made and Secretary Esper has reaffirmed.
Let me take you to the force structure piece of the equation. Army's always sought to increase force structure, but the challenge always has been at the expense of what else? You're on an unprecedented, or it hasn't been in decades, to have this kind of modernization focus on the part of the force. Where does force structure go? How do you get more impact from the forces that you have, whether through new deployment models or force structure model?
So 60% of combatant commanders' requirements are Army. So demand is still at a breathtaking pace. So we are going to continue to grow by about 2,000 in the active force year over year. We're going to not sacrifice quality, but grow steadily. We think that with that growth, it could potentially put pressure on the system. We have to modernize. We have a window to modernize. We will not sacrifice modernization in the out years. But for the 21, we're going to ask to grow by another 2,000 and steadily try to put more density in our formations.
How are you working with the other services? You mentioned, and I've got two more questions after this. How are you working with your sister services? Each one of the service chiefs and each one of the secretaries is looking at reinventing their enterprises on a whole variety of levels. I know that that's something that folks think about it in an acquisition sense, but C. Crew Brown, the commander of Pacific Air Forces, said, hey, look, we're going to have to outthink this problem. It's not a spending problem, it's not an equipment problem, it's an outthinking problem. Talk to me about how you're working with each of the services to sort of outthink the problem, given the magnitude of the challenges facing the United States, which is actually trying to deter conflict globally to maintain that sort of stable global commons that is actually in everybody's interest.
So from an operational model, it's really incredible how much work that we're doing together to transform doctrine from the air-land battle of the 80s to multi-domain operations. I personally led a contingent to our Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, back in the May-June timeframe, and I had the N3 of the Navy, and I had the A3 of the Air Force, and we sat around and went through simulations for hours. So tremendous sponsorship at the top, highest levels of the department to change the operating model, because the operating model's changes will change force structure. But like I mentioned before with hypersonics and cyber and other things, we're partnering now more than ever. But we're not creating these massive joint program offices. We just have senior leaders directing interest and making sure that the requirements of how we fight are not totally altered, but try to get the best economies of scale, but learn from each other.
How are you, I just have to ask this question, how are you driving change in the force, intellectually and otherwise, right? The Army and each of the services can move very rapidly, but what's the basic fundamental message you're delivering across the force from the highest level to the lowest about how we should think about where we are, the importance of change, and how to move fast?
Empowerment of our people. We really have been able to empower the four-star commanders and our assistant secretaries. You mentioned the night court process. That was one mechanism. The four-star commanders and assistant secretaries own those budgets now. Where you see a General McConville or a Jim McPherson or a Joe Martin or I weigh in, it's usually that top 10% of that peg, which of what they own of their funding, where you're going to put the seed corn in for a transformative change, which will be the higher risk type of investments. But it's really been empowerment.
Let me ask you two last questions. One, U.S. forces had to make a very hasty retreat. The Russians punked us on Twitter, writing on a grease pencil board of a place that we had just vacated from. Are you concerned that there is any technology, given the haste with which American forces withdrew, that are not going to be of some advantage to Russian forces or potentially get into Syrian hands or other radio equipment, books, documents, anything else that could potentially be used to advantage by the Russians?
I would have to defer to the Joint Staff about the manner in which the adjustment and disposition of forces was conducted and how they, what they did with defense articles. I mean, that's an operational issue. With respect to the disposition of change in forces, it's about the national objectives and what we're trying to achieve in the region.
Let me ask you one question. You were a soldier, ranger. What do you, there's been a lot of anger about the decision, about folks, about, battle buddies and, that we fought with these guys, a little bit of a concern about Afghanistan and the message we're sending in terms of how we withdraw. How do you talk to soldiers about that as a soldier, as the Secretary of the Army, about how they should think about what's happening? Because I've really been surprised that the passion that the decision has invoked in soldiers who fought alongside Kurdish forces, for example.
I expect the passion, and I expect candor. I encourage it, quite frankly, that they speak out and they emphasize their lessons learned and their concerns. But at the end of the day, once a national decision is made, we salute and we move out.
Ryan McCarthy, 24th Secretary of the United States Army. It's always a pleasure, sir. Thanks very much. Fair winds, following seas, break a leg. How do you think the Army-Navy game is going to go?
We're going to win again.
Outstanding, sir. Thanks very, very much.
Good.